Hey, it's Silja here. I've been promising a third installment of what I promised to be a video series, and I haven't, well, let's put it this way. I haven't really been able to. The Finnish winters are rough, and I've also been waiting for the right kind of inspiration to hit, and it just hit in a way that I didn't expect, and I need to do this for someone who I consider forever to be a personal hero of mine, because as far as I'm concerned, his most amazing, stupendous investigative work has just basically been dissed in an otherwise phenomenal documentary just released on Netflix. Those of you who have access to it, it was mentioned on The Daily Show. Trevor Noah interviewed the filmmaker. The film is called Crack, Cocaine, Corruption, and Conspiracy. And it does a better than average job of breaking down just how horrific crack was when it hit. And this is coming from someone who actually lived through it and saw it firsthand in LA. I remember seeing my first crack smoker, a white man, popping out of the bushes after having smoked all night when I was probably 13, so that would have been about 83. My high school, at the time when I graduated from it, had the highest murder and suicide rate related largely to the crack trade and to the Bloods and the Crips and all the other gangs that popped up around them. That was in 88. I lived in East Oakland, at that time going to a college, but going to sleep every night to the sound of gunfire. And in Los Angeles, for instance, going to sleep every night to the sound of what were called ghetto birds or helicopters. LA had become a war zone, and we saw police brutality on a scale where even those of you who have seen it firsthand in the United States can't fully fathom what it is to have an entire police force turn on an entire community, not just one city, because Los Angeles County incorporates so many cities, but on entire communities of color, and particularly African American communities. One of the most important things to know, and this is true, documented in the documentary, in my book, and every other possible statistic that you can find on the subject, most crack users were and are actually not people of color, but Euro-Americans, or whites, as some of you would use the word. What outrages me is not the fact that this documentary exists, because it's high time for people who didn't grow up in that era, or really don't understand the degree to which communities were absolutely disemboweled. In essence, their guts were ripped out. But to understand how political the issue became, how major a role the media played in making the issue one that criminalized individuals who had become addicted to a substance that they could not possibly fully understand. People tend to self-medicate when they're poor and traumatized. This is not news to anybody. Cocaine had certainly been used by the middle classes, the upper middle classes, powdered cocaine, that is, for a really long time. It was in Coca-Cola beverages. It was completely legal for a long time. But I don't want to digress too much here. The most important thing for you to understand about the crack cocaine epidemic is that it is one of the ugliest chapters in American social and political history, modern social and political history, but that it was the work of several journalists leading up to a man named Gary Webb that brought to the fore the fact that this wasn't a matter of so-called zombies or men and women who had no moral compass ruining the country. The fact of the matter was that the CIA, the DEA, and local police enforcement, especially in LA, were integrally involved in, and I'll just say it, making crack happen in the United States. They set the fire. Not just the fuel, they brought in the crack. Now, I previously said the CIA looked the other way. Gary Webb himself was very careful in saying that he couldn't prove that the CIA actually had an agenda of bringing in crack cocaine, but there is absolutely no question that they knew it on the highest levels, that weapons were being shipped down to the Contras in Nicaragua, and that in those very same planes were coming back packed with cocaine, which was then turned into crack, which was then sold all over Los Angeles County, West Coast to East Coast, no question, and a lot of this documentary does focus on the East Coast. My experience was entirely on the West Coast, and for what it's worth, even at the time when I was still living in Seattle and had to flee in 2010, I could walk 2 blocks and be near one of the crack capitals of Seattle. So crack was very, very much still, even then, running the streets and in control of people's lives. I know that the opioid crisis has hit in a different way since I've left, but from what I understand from people I'm in contact with, it's not as if crack has disappeared. Let me go back to what I really need to say here. Gary Webb is not once mentioned in this documentary, and I find it very sad that time and again, men and women, courageous men and women throughout history who put their lives on the line, as Gary did, are being written out of history. Were it not for his series, which came out in the San Jose Mercury News, it was a multi-part series called The Dark Alliance, proving the connections between these major drug traffickers, between the Contras and the CIA. Had it not been for that series and the subsequent book that he wrote, and this is a hardcover that I have, The Dark Alliance, look at the size of this thing, like the Bible. I don't mean like the Bible, like the content is, but I'm talking about, look how much work went into this. Gary Webb's work was so essential in exposing what then led to community-wide outrage, which then led to an unprecedented event where the CIA director at the time had to come and face the Black community in South Central Los Angeles. I remember, in fact, there was someone in the audience even shouting, like, where's Gary Webb? He needs to be here. He's the man who exposed all of this. This book, this man's name, and the fact that he lost not only his reputation, but his profession, was hounded out of journalism, despite having won innumerable awards. His identity, his career, his family, everything that he had in the world was destroyed because he dared to stumble into that dark territory, that dark alliance. It ruined his life. He did write this book, which further documented everything that he had established in that news series, which further documented it. He wasn't the first, and at least I will say this, the documentary maker does interview some of the original journalists who reported on the connections that they started seeing between the Contras and drug trafficking coming into South Central LA in particular. I want to read you something here. And why am I talking about this? Well, there's 2 reasons. One is because I know that one day I'm not going to be here anymore. And much in the same way that I want someone to remember that I once gave my life for these stories that I wrote and for the subject which haunts me every single day, which is super maximum confinement or solitary confinement in the United States, and how it is used as both a method of social control and experimentation and then exported to Black sites and American military prisons abroad has been in the past and is currently. Much in the same way that I hope that someone remembers me, I will not allow this man's name to be forgotten. So I want to read you one passage, and then I want to touch on something else before calling it a night. Here's Gary Webb on page 442 of the hardcover book. I knew from my research what kind of backlash would result from a story that dirtied up the CIA, and I stressed it repeatedly to my editors. New York Times reporter Seymour Hersh's 1974 expose of Operation Chaos, a massive illegal CIA domestic spying operation, which I haven't even talked about yet, had brought on attacks in the Washington Post. In parentheses, he had no quote-unquote hard proof, end quote, or end parentheses, and Time magazine, quote, there is strong likelihood that Hersh's CIA story is considerably exaggerated, among many others. CBS newsman Daniel Shore was demonized by the CIA and conservative commentators for leaking a copy of a secret congressional report of CIA abuses to the Village Voice in '76, after CBS had declined to make it public. Eventually, Shore was dumped by the network and virtually blackballed. A decade later, a similar fate befell Robert Perry, who I believe is in that documentary, and Brian Barger of the Associated Press after they broke several stories on Contra involvement with drug trafficking and Ollie North's secret resupply operation. In both cases, the mainstream journalistic community uttered barely a peep of protest. In Gary Webb's case, they did more than not utter an ounce of protest. They did worse. They went after him themselves. The Washington Post, the LA Times, and his own paper, eventually, which printed a sorry-ass retraction and then had to come around eventually, as did the CIA itself, and admit that, hey, you know what, all that was true. What's sad is even if you look at his Wikipedia page today, it still refers to this as somehow being controversial, or others use the word infamous. There's nothing controversial or infamous about his work. It's been absolutely proved and documented. And yet, and still, his name doesn't even appear as a mention in a documentary about, as I said, one of the greatest social and political crises in American history. Now, why am I talking to you about Gary Webb? Okay, well, that's obvious. Why am I talking to you about crack and, what I saw in LA and all this and that? I want you all to understand something, because I do hear it from people, and I certainly heard it, especially when I first started to write about prisons and prisoners. For that matter, again, people living on the margins of society. So, people who have to survive on sex work, people who are using or abusing drugs, homeless people, et cetera, et cetera. There's an us and them relationship that America has always, or it's America's politicians and leaders have always loved to use, especially when it comes to election time. Unfortunately, most Americans have internalized this idea of the other, or of the people who are not deserving of care or of empathy or of atonement or, for instance, of earlier compassionate release. Those of you who weren't alive during this time, and those of you who don't know this history, have to understand that whereas before the American prison population, I'm just looking back a few decades, stood at around 300,000 and now is well over 2 million. And of course, it's gone up, it's gone down, it's still over 2 million. The fact of the matter is that the United States has been able to effectively criminalize a group of people that essentially have done nothing but not be members of middle or upper middle class society. So people who have tried to figure out how to survive in a hyper-capitalistic economy by living basically on street capitalism. That's not to say that drug dealing is admirable or the banging is admirable or anything of the sort. I'm just saying, what's up with the judgment? The fact of the matter is that about 7 million people are wrapped up right at this very moment in some aspect of the correctional system. They've been arrested or they're under probation or any number of things. We know that over 2 million people are locked up at this very moment, and just under 5 million are under some form of correctional supervision. That means active correctional supervision, which, as many former prisoners will tell you, is actually in many ways worse. The control is even worse. They're monitoring you, looking for you to make the smallest of mistakes, and it makes it really hard to reintegrate. One of the things that I hear and see, have heard, have seen is this distancing. It's that us and them concept. Audre Lorde rightly referred to it as othering, if I'm not mistaken, or the other. And I want to just call you all out on the fact that if you live in America with its plethora of laws, and especially those laws that, for instance, were in place before most states started to legalize or decriminalize marijuana, for instance, anybody who's had 2 drinks and gotten in a car and driven home, anybody who's ever stolen a magazine or a lipstick from a department store, anyone who's jaywalked has committed a crime in America. America is a country supposedly of law and order, but we know fully well that as long as you have sufficient money, means, privilege, access to lawyers, you're likely, if you are, in the unlikely event that you are a person of privilege and you're arrested, you are going to be bailed out. You're not going to spend 2 years waiting for what won't even be a trial, as over roughly 99% of the people who end up in prison have taken plea deals. And that's largely because of a completely underfunded public defense system and public defenders who are both overworked and in some cases don't give a shit. And judges who have little, if any, compassion for the people who stand before them. I want you to try, if you don't already have this in you, to imagine a scenario in which one of those crimes that you have probably committed in your lifetime, a minor one or a major one that you got away with, ended you up in prison or in jail. And now imagine that you're living in the 1980s or 90s during a time in which mandatory minimum sentencing is introduced, whereby for simply possessing the amount of like 5 sugar packets worth of crack, you are sent to prison for 5 to 40 years at a minimum. People that I've known of have been sent to life in prison for marijuana-related offenses. And we're not even talking about dealers when we're talking about crack cocaine. Why am I bringing up something now that is from the 1980s having to do with crack cocaine, or 1990s? Because these men and women are still in prison. And it's so hard for people to understand that just because we now have a quote-unquote regime change in the United States, and Biden, who was once an incredibly pro-drug war individual, he's actually shown as such in this documentary. Yes, okay, so he's changed his mind about things. But many of these men and women are still doing time. And what's even more amazing is if you look at who's in the supermaxes, who's in these isolation units that I've talked about, well, many of those very people came out of that era that I came out of. There's a reason why, as I explained, I gravitated toward this kind of reporting. And it's because, as I mentioned, but for the grace of God, there go I. Now, okay, so you're thinking, but she came from this different background and she was on the streets or whatever. And okay, all of that's true. Okay, yes, I had it harder than some of you. And I can't say I had the hardest of all the people that I've known, as I've known people who have done bids 20, 30 years in solitary, who I honestly still cannot imagine how they survive from day to day. Put me in this apartment for 2 to 3 days in this Finnish winter, and I start to go stir crazy. So imagine your life from the 1980s or the 90s onward, at a time when absolutely no treatment is available to you, and the cops are literally using military-grade equipment to bust down doors and drag people out in handcuffs, bloodied, beaten, and chain ganged. I mean, straight out of slavery pictures, dragging black and brown bodies out of their houses with their children screaming and watching, and very quickly sentencing these people to decades in prison. Now, some of these people have gotten out, as the system is so overburdened, but many of these people are still inside. And the more time you do inside, the more likely it is that you'll infract to the point where you eventually end up in one of these solitary confinement units. And as I've said before, sometimes it's a question of a few months, sometimes it's a question of a few years, and in many cases, it's a question of decades. The other thing I'm going to explain to you is that, yes, people don't believe me, but yes, it's entirely possible for you to come into the system as a nonviolent offender and end up being kept in a place like a SHU in Pelican Bay, where ostensibly we are locking up, and I use the word we because I used to live there in America, where your American tax dollars, you are spending anywhere from 40 to 80,000 a year to keep one person, depending on his age, his or her age, and medical health or medical condition and mental health issues, to keep them locked up for 1 year, where a small fraction of that amount could have originally gone into treatment, housing, food, job training, college. You're not that different. And I want you to care. I want you to start looking at, if you don't already have your brothers and sisters locked up, I want you to start looking at who's really in there. For those of you who still care about the subject or are just learning to care, please do something. I'm no longer there. I can't write about the subjects the way I used to. This burden is on you. Please heed my call. And please never forget the name of Gary Webb.